Silver Eye Society.
Welcome to another episode of the Silver Eye Society. We're going back to a classic film, a famous film, The Shining. One of the many Kubrick films that we have been covering. We've done, what was the other one?
This is the third, actually.
The War one. What's the other one?
It's Full Metal Jacket, and we have done Dr. Strangelove as well.
Ah, that's right. That's it. My memory fails me, but the podcast doesn't. Those episodes are out for those who seek them. But in this episode, we're going to be going in a different direction. The Shining is an interesting movie. It's a favorite movie of many people. It's a famous movie, all that, blah, blah. There's tons of weird theories about it on the internet. I tried to do a little research just to see what the public thinks. And you know what? Maybe the public should be censored because there are some very strange theories about this movie. I think when you get a movie that's this big, this masterful, when it's such a famous and iconic movie, you're bound to have a lot of strange theories on it. But we're gonna go straight to the core concepts in this movie that are uncontested. No weird film conspiracy theories here. Just straight up ideas. And the first idea we'll get into here is isolation. This is one of the central themes in The Shining. The idea of going off on your own and what you find when you're alone with yourself. We're also going to talk about something you can't ignore in this film, which is the idea of location, place, and what that has to do with your own mind, how the physical world is kind of like, can be this kind of metaphor for our internal world. Very famously, there is a maze in this movie, and that's an important part of how locations can help us understand our own psychology. And ultimately, one of the most interesting parts of The Shining is the main character of Jack Torrance. So we're going to look at Jack as the figure of father that becomes monster, and what it means to be a failed father figure, both in the sense of the family, but also in the sense of a society, this failed figure of care, of protection, of rationality. Justin will talk about the failure of logos. Jack is a writer, and he is supposed to be this figure of knowledge, and he is not. And to sum it up, we're going to pose an interesting question that I think The Shining makes you consider, which is whether resentment breeds evil or whether evil breeds resentment and failure. And that's something Justin brought up, this interesting way to look at Jack's character as becoming susceptible to evil because of his own failures. And so we'll look at that in the sphere of the film itself, but also take it to the larger, everyday life, which is, do you become a shitty person when you fail at life? Does failure make you a bad person? And is that a reason why you should try to do things and try to succeed? Not just for the success itself, but so that you don't become possessed by ancient demons in a hotel and murder your family. So let's roll straight ahead into the word of the podcast.
The word of the podcast this episode is going to be Labyrinth. And on a side note, I'd just like to say, despite all of my co-host failures, I still think that she is a great person and most likely won't murder anyone inside of a historical hotel. I'd just like to put that out publicly.
Thank you. That's so moving. I'm so deeply touched that you feel that way. Thank you. I think it's good to put that out publicly,
I'd give it a
90%.
90% chance you don't murder people in a hotel. And I think that's pretty good.
That's a great percentage. That's, just the hotel, though. We don't know about the other spheres of life.
Labyrinth. We're going to use the word labyrinth today and for the word of the podcast. This is circa 1400. A labyrinth, a maze, a great building with many corridors and turns. Figuratively, a bewildering argument. From the Latin, labyrinthus. From the Greek, labyrinthos. A maze, large building with intricate passages. And you pointed out that it's not just the hedge garden maze thing out in this film that is the maze, but that the camera angles often portray the hotel itself as this type of maze. And so then when I looked up this word, seeing that labyrinth is also a great building with many corridors and turns, that brought it together a little bit visually, the visual elements of this film. Now, a little further, slight bit further, into the maze of the word of the podcast. Apparently from a pre-Greek language, that's old, traditionally connected to Lydian labrys, a double-edged axe.
Oh.
Whoa. So many surprises when we do word archaeology, the word of the podcast. A double-edged axe. Well, there's an axe in this film, isn't there?
There is, famously.
A symbol of royal power, which fits with the theory that the original labyrinth was the royal Minoan palace on Crete. We won't get into the history of that. Some of you will know the story of the Minotaur, all that. There's one other aspect of this, which is a later usage is a confusing state of affairs. Now, I don't want to spoil it for you, but at the end, in the labyrinth, the main character is howling incoherently, without the ability to speak, confused, lost. That will tie into the talk we'll have about the logos.
You're confused and lost, I think. You may be in a labyrinth of your own.
The word of the podcast requires a strong spirit.
Logos.
A strong spirit. It requires the breadcrumbs of knowledge to be scattered to find our way back into the main episode. And sometimes I require some help from you to bring myself out of the labyrinth of the word of the podcast. But I do this for the people, as I've always said. The people demand the word of the podcast. They get the word of the podcast, even if I have to sacrifice myself going into the depths of the language.
Incredible. What a service. All right.
Briefly.
Let's get into the...
Briefly. What do you think my chances are of not murdering somebody in a hotel?
As long as you don't go to a hotel, great. So I have great faith that you won't murder anyone in a hotel as long as you stay out of a hotel. Your percentages cannot give you one as high as mine, unfortunately. So let's not put that in public, because should you go into a hotel, I don't want to ever have to testify against you, you know? I ain't no snitch.
I like large buildings that are empty and devoid of humanity. I really enjoy, on a personal note, I enjoy wandering around. And I would have taken this job at that Overlook Hotel, and I would not have murdered anybody.
You don't have a wife and kids, so yeah.
Correct.
You would just be hanging out with the ghosts. Like, you'd love that. That'd be great. All of you dead inside, so, you know.
I actually thought about that when I was watching the movie. I thought about it. I was like, I would stay in my little apartment area, and I would let the ghosts and the spirits have their area, and I would just not bother them. I mean, they are guests. Let's have some responsibility to the guests. Give them their space to do whatever they're doing. It appears that the blood gushing out of the elevator shaft disappears. They clean up after themselves. So,
yeah, live and let live. Don't tread on the demons.
Don't do it.
Anyway, let's get on into the real podcast, not the little intro. I'm saying. And we're going to start with the concept of isolation. Sorry to denigrate your intro. I see the percentage of likelihood of murder dropping by the moment. Now, isolation is an important part in this film is basically the starting point, right? So they're in the city, whatever. You have these very symbolic, very tried and true themes, which is we're going off to an isolated, remote location. We're going away from the city and civilization. We are cut off from the city and civilization. All these, basic, yes, we are alone, you're in isolation. Now, isolation is a fun concept to think about now since we've in some ways experienced isolation through lockdowns and all that, at least at the beginning. Now everybody's just lying and saying like, stay home, be safe. No one's actually fucking doing that, but let's continue to, say that we are. You are the fucking lockdown hero.
I am doing it. There is no...
They should parade you out like, let's go, Justin.
I truly deserve...
the patron saint of lockdowns. But, yours is willing. So there's a message in that. Anyway, so there's something here about, the typical writer seeking a retreat, writer seeking peace and quiet so that he can get in touch with his inspiration. But the thing about isolation is that you will get in touch with something, but it may not be inspiration per se. And this movie is a great sobering lens for viewing solitude and isolation as, yes, a tool for self-discovery, but one that should be wielded carefully. There's this quaint idea that, if only we could just, I love to be alone. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, when we say this now, I say this and it's like my phone is on 24 hours a day. I didn't check it for a few hours. I love to be alone and sit and read. Like, we don't even know what alone is anymore. There are levels to alone, and alone being in a haunted hotel in the mountains, locked off from civilization, no phone, and then the radio has been destroyed by a crazy possessed person. That's alone. So there are levels to alone. And
again, this sounds like a perfect vacation to me. I just want to point out that you're describing this.
Maybe you're one of the fools that thinks like, I'll go off and write, and then you're just going to be dancing with the ghosts. You don't know.
All those people
you don't know what you'll find.
Were successfully stayed during the time, except 10 years prior in the film. It's just because this person is, which I'll go into further,
yes,
a problem, that the problems occur. So
exactly.
You're just describing, again, it's just a brochure for a vacation for me when I see that. They're going to pay me.
Overlook Hotel.
Pay me to be alone. I get to walk around in the middle of the night, like exploring
I'd be so
abandoned.
scared.
I would. I love it so much. I love to be.
Yeah, but I get scared of everything.
Right.
I get frightened. I'm scared of ghosts and shit, even though I don't believe them. I watched this movie and it took me two sessions to watch it, and each night I was like, the VCR turned off for, remember I called you, I was like,
yeah. Go ahead and tell the people what happened.
I will tell them, because it's a testament to Kubrick's skill that I didn't even get halfway through the movie and I was already scared of appliances making, sounds in the middle of the night. I was nervous. You never know when you're going to find out that you're wrong about ghosts and shit. That's what people don't understand. It's like, they're not real. Demons aren't real. That shit is not real. Okay, until it is. That's the problem. The Logos is deluding us. You have to understand that there's another realm that cannot be understood through the rational. And we don't know. We don't know about it until we know about it. So, I'm not saying that I believe in ghosts. I'm not coming here to say that. I'm just saying that I get creeped out because I am open to the possibility of weird shit, like a VCR being haunted. Anyway, enough of my personal struggles with this film. It's just a good job. Look, there's a bunch of things that, let me just get this off of my chest really quick. I think this movie's fucking great. I think people should watch it again. I think it creeps you out. And I would like to note that the soundtrack is phenomenal. The soundtrack, good movies, sometimes you don't even notice how good the soundtrack is unless you pay attention, because the soundtrack just feels like the movie. And the soundtrack in this fucking movie is so good. I can't describe it totally. I'd have to, it would be in its own podcast. But there's all this filming techniques, like the windingness of how they film the movie, where they're walking towards the camera and then there's all these turns and turns that makes this hotel feel endless and winding. And it's packed full of all these little details, and so many things are going on, which can be burdensome to deal with, and it'll fucking wake your ass up when you watch a movie like this and you've been kind of watching, contemporary normal shit, and you go to watch a movie like this. Holy fuck, what the fuck are we doing? We're all watching like children's TV practically compared to something like this. And I'm not saying this is the best movie ever. We both think that there's better Kubrick movies. I think that we like better, but this is still so phenomenal. So whatever, let me get back to the idea of isolation. So yes, isolation, if you can handle it and you know about yourself, you don't become an axe murderer in isolation. That's the hope. But the problem is that Jack's character is the quintessential unindividualized man. He has all these issues, all these failures, all this guilt and resentment that's undealt with. And in going to Solitude and finally sitting in a room by himself with this book that he's supposed to write because he's going to be a writer. He's fired from a teacher, but who cares, because he's going to be a writer and he's just been prevented from that. Now he's confronted with the fact that there's nothing there to stop him from doing this thing that he said he's going to do. But so that's actually when he starts to develop into this monster, when it's almost that he cannot delude himself about his failures anymore. And that's when he starts to turn on his family. And there's a very interesting thing there, this idea that in solitude is when you can no longer lie to yourself about what kind of a piece of shit you are. In solitude is when you have to confront truly where your failure comes from. It's no longer something that you can blame other people because no one else is there anymore. And so you see that in this movie. And it's that other side of solitude, that it's not just this quaint cabin retreat. It's also the potential darkness that you find when you're sitting alone with yourself and you realize, oh shit, there's a lot more to me than I've been confronting, and not all of it is good. So let's move ahead then, shall we, into the location, the Overlook Hotel. Such an ominous location. It's a character in itself.
It's interesting to me that you have an expert on isolation on your podcast, and yet you just go off on this soliloquy without even communicating to the actual expert in isolation. But in
isolation, the expert in isolation. That's excellent. That should be your autobiography.
Well,
that should be your podcast. You should branch off of this one since you're so abused, and you can start your own, and it can be the expert in isolation. I would listen to it.
Exactly.
Yeah. You
would listen to it. We're going to need in the future people who are capable of isolation in order to travel in space, Ooh. And so I'm just preparing myself for space travel.
You're not going to space, you crackhead. What are you talking about? You've got to be like at the top of your life's game to go to space. You'd kill the spaceship in space. I don't trust you in space. I don't think you'd come back. You'd hijack the spaceship. I would never send you to space.
Okay, well, there are some,
God knows what we would see. As a monkey, like Laika, send you to space like they shot the dog into space to see, will it explode? That's why I'd send you to space, to see what happens. Just to see not about space. You're not going to fucking collect algae off the moon or some shit. I would just want to see what happened to you. It'd be very The Shining. The Shining, but in space.
You're right.
Hey, Kubrick made that movie.
Exactly.
That Space Odyssey. Isn't that kind of The Shining in space in some ways? I haven't seen it in a while, but.
I think we should send you to space. Then you could go get algae on the moon. because you clearly have a high level of scientific understanding if you think there's algae on the moon.
I know there's not algae on the moon. I don't know what they call the shit that they collect on the moon, but they're always up there trying to, scrape shit off of planets and asteroids, trying to find if there's a microbe that is alive or whatever. I don't know what they call it. That's why I'm not going to space, because I don't care if it's algae or fungi or moongitis. I don't know what it is. That's what astronauts do. It's not my expertise. I tell you about isolation and the logos and demons on Earth. That's what we do.
So
we can run a podcast on the spaceship, though.
Listen.
That'd be scary.
I am going to, in the future, I have a lot of business ideas I bring out on the podcast.
Oh, boy.
And so I'm just thinking about hotel travel. I mean, what is a spaceship?
Hotel travel. I think that's an excellent. Let's think about that one. Maybe we can shoot a hotel into space. Is that your idea? You've got a lot of good ones.
I hope that I live a long time only to spite you. I hope that someday this podcast is famous only so I can have the funds. Only so I can have the funds to launch a space hotel. Now, no, I'm not going to launch you could have a suborbital hotel. You could have that. But I'm thinking more of, getting a crew together, putting them on the moon, or maybe a moon of Saturn or Jupiter or something. Probably not that, actually. Okay, I'll work out the logistics. But then have a hotel, a moon hotel. Okay, fuck it. That's what I'm going to do. I quit the podcast and I'm going to begin. Movie. I quit the podcast right now. I'm going to go into isolation and develop my plans for Moon Hotel.
Build your Moon Hotel.
People would like that. Sane. Look, who's going to go to space? Rich people. That's it. And like peasant workers that they use to like mine lithium and to build the Moon Hotel, and things like that. I'm not saying I would exploit moon peasants. Let's move along. I can't release my designs publicly. I'm not trying to exploit moon peasants.
All right. Let's go. You have some more words on isolation? You were so offended that I bypassed your expertise, and then all you started talking about was moon hotel travel after denigrating me for talking about space algae. Let's simmer down, with the expertise here. Maybe we should speed ahead to the failure of logos, because clearly this is the experts are, how do you say, in residence, clearly.
Yeah, so on a serious note,
please,
just wanted to say, which I think you've already said, isolation is tolerable. And I think that a lot of it has to do with if you're already a monstrous person, then isolation. This goes to the question at the beginning of the podcast. Do certain negative things make you a monster, or does being a monster ahead of time make you exhibit negative things? And I think that a well-adjusted, well, that's not a term I'd use for myself. Okay, so maybe all I'm trying to say is when we look at the data, you got about every 10 years someone at the Overlook Hotel violently murders people, right? So maybe 1 out of 10 people are not good at isolation, at dealing with isolation.
Then maybe the whole movie is a mental health lesson. Isn't 1 out of 10 people severely mentally ill? So there you go.
I don't know. But
there's a lot of theories on the movie. I looked up one that was like, they're a little bit silly. I don't know. One was like, it's Wendy that's crazy. I'm like, well, no, let's not do the whole thing where it's like everything is imagined. I hate that.
But what we've done, that's foolish. What we've done is actually slyly, subconsciously, unconsciously referenced a major conspiracy theory, which dovetails into Stanley Kubrick in this movie. Are you aware of it?
The moon landing. But I don't know the actual conspiracy. I just know its existence.
The conspiracy is that there is a subset of people in a secret society who have secretly been building a moon hotel on the dark side of the moon for many generations. And someday tickets will be sold. Not tickets, I suppose. Reservations will be taken. No, you see that, we won't get into that. There's no reason to get into that. But there is one scene, I think, where the kid is wearing an Apollo spaceship. And I suppose that's a reference to that. I don't know anything about it. Let's move on to the next.
What is it? You have to explain what it is. I don't even know what it is.
Oh, really? Oh, so...
Yeah, I don't know what the conspiracy is about the movie. I don't know.
No. Well, I mean, that... There's that the moon landing is faked. That is a conspiracy, right?
Okay, yeah,
and
I know that one.
Stanley Kubrick was the one that filmed the fake moon footage in the desert. And so then throughout time he released in his film subtle clues to the fact that he had actually been the one that had faked the footage.
See, the thing about these conspiracies is that they make the world so much cooler than it actually is. Like, imagine if your government collaborated with Stanley Kubrick to release, like, false footage of going to space. Like, I mean, wow, our government has such an artistic and respectable CV, I guess. Like, we've worked with Stanley Kubrick. Great. But, I just don't understand the idea that we faked the moon. Like, who cares? What, for morale? So we could just be like, we did it first. Like, that's the whole fucking point? Oh, come on.
Well, that partially was the point, propaganda-wise, because it's not like, as you may know as a scientist, we didn't collect a lot of moon algae on the moon. We went up there and kind of walked around and then left. Plus, we stopped going to the moon. We only did it a few times and then left.
The moon is small potatoes. The moon ain't a lot up there. It's just the fucking rock. Like, there's bigger planets to land on. The whole point was it's a moon landing.
Well, the moon's not a planet.
Look.
Number one.
Well, you know what I mean.
Well, I do, and you're wrong. The moon's not a planet. And also, the point of it all was to show that you could, to some degree, develop an ICBM. That's the whole point of if you could think about what a giant rocket is, with people on top and a little capsule, then going to the moon. It's just saying we have the power to send a missile halfway across the world and hit the Soviet Union. So that's all part of the space race thing, is showing, these are new weapons developments in essence, right? But yeah, I think that tied into all that was this idea of, look, we're going to do it first because, small sidetrack, the Soviet Union had been the first to put up satellites with Sputnik. Yeah. And they had been the first to put an animal in space, which, it's a sad story. And then, so, yeah, a lot of it was just propaganda. So some theories say we did go to the moon, but actually we were bad at filming it or something. Well, I think, look, I'm no expert in this conspiracy theory. I'm really not. But I think there was some theories of, well, we got them to orbit the moon, but we couldn't actually... We didn't have the technology to get them safely down and then back up again, so we filmed that part of it, but we actually did send them, because, clearly people have eyes in their head. They saw rockets, take off, I assume. I don't know. Maybe it's all a mystery. Maybe we're in a simulation and we live on the moon now. Maybe we're already in Moon Hotel. Who knows? Yeah,
I was just going to say, hey, whatever. There's worse places to be, I guess.
That's my slogan for Moon Hotel when I make it. Moon Hotel. There's worse places to be, I guess. That's it.
That's pretty good, actually.
How hard do you have to try?
For our times.
Yeah, it's not like you're going to have a bunch of choice. Once you get to the moon, I'm the only moon hotel there. So would you like to die in space, or would you like to have a room? That's
you have a monopoly on moon travel, so that's always promising business enterprise. All right. So let's move on to locations then, since we're seeming to gather up here on the moon as a location that's not even in this movie. So let's move to some locations that are in this movie.
Or is it?
Dun, dun, dun. The maze. Let's talk about the maze in this movie. So we said that it's shot kind of like maze-like, right? Where there's all these winding, walking around and turns. And there is a literal maze in the movie. So there's the hedge maze, and then there's the replica, like the little model of the hedge maze inside the hotel that Jack looks at while the mom and the child actually go into the maze. And maze, of course, is a very symbolic concept. The idea of something confusing, is some kind of journey, having to travel from one place to another and this winding road that you may not figure your way out of. So what is life but a maze in some ways, right? Oh, look at that. Wow. This is what you pay for, guys. This is great content. Poetry. So the maze, I think there's a lot here. I like to look at the maze as kind of this symbol of, well, there's kind of this downward spiral element, right? And this kind of windingness of the edge of sanity and kind of this escape in regards for the mother and the child to escape the maze, whereas Jack does not escape the maze, literally. So it's both this actual event that occurs in the film, but then this kind of symbol for trying to navigate the maze of your own inner mess. Can you unwind all the strange neuroses and the ways you deceive yourself? Can you navigate that to come out on the other end of sanity? And there's a very interesting thing here, I think. If you've ever done psychedelic drugs, there is I can't remember what it's called, but there's this way your thinking changes. I think it's described in some way, I can't remember, but there's different ways of thinking. And one of the weird things that happens for individuals who choose to legally consume psychedelic substances is that your thinking gets really weird. It's no longer the kind of linear, normal thinking that we tend to, think of as thinking, which is I think of this concept and I come out of these little branches as I think about it, right? Like think of, like those mind maps that people draw when they're coming up with ideas. You'll have the big idea and then these little offshoots. That's kind of the rational, linear mode of thinking. But there's also chaos thinking, which tends to come with any drug use, really. But psychedelics is a more pleasant way to describe that because it's not entirely detrimental, where your thinking changes so much. And that's kind of why, in some regards, people like these things for creativity. Because instead of that kind of A to B thinking, you can go from D to B and from C to F. And it's just like the thinking changes. The way that you think about subjects, the way you draw connections changes. And so, I don't know, I see this idea of the maze as something that can be a symbol for understanding how we understand ourselves and how we think things through. Do you have this kind of obscure, chaotic thinking pattern? Do you have a very I walk from point A to point B pattern? Or can you navigate these like the labyrinth of thoughts when you start to really get into weird thinking and trying to think about things deeply in new ways? Then you can't do linear thinking, right? Because that's the most common way to think about things. You would have to think about things in a very different way. And I think once you start messing with ideas, right? It's kind of like when we talk about Jung and his ideas, you think a little bit differently. You engage with ideas a little bit differently. Not to say it's not rational or it's crazy, but it's this idea of the labyrinth, which goes back to the way that you defined it as kind of confusing. What was it? Thinking pattern? I think you said it was exactly that.
So I'm reading Symbols of Transformation, I think is what it's called, by Carl Jung. And the very beginning of the book, he talks about the first or second chapter is called Two Ways of Thinking. And the first is, and this will tie into the Logos, which maybe we'll start to touch in to now. The first is directed, rational, step-by-step, logical thinking. And then he contrasts this with the second type of thinking, which he associates with the imagination of children, with the mindset of the ancients, who still saw the world as infused with spirit and what we would call supernatural things, and with dreaming. So those three types of things he puts over as the second type of thinking, as opposed to the logical and the rational. So let me try to extract our viewers from that maze, that muddled maze that you just handed them, which somehow has to do with psychedelic drugs. Even though I understand what you mean, and of course I understand what you mean, but I think lateral thinking maybe is what you're talking about when you're talking about being able to move side to side.
Maybe I can't remember the term, but that might be.
So the logos, shall we?
We shall.
Would you like to talk about the
father?
Well,
the failed
I
father?
think we need to know what the logos is, right? Do you want to know what the logos is, viewers?
Should we start there, or should we talk about whatever? Okay, just tell us what the logos is.
You need to know a brief history of the logos. Here is a brief history of the logos, given to you by someone who is not an expert. Let's go back to ancient Greece. A man named Heraclitus, a philosopher. His most famous maxim being you can't cross the same river twice. That's Heraclitus.
Heraclitus was pretty based, if I say so myself.
He may have been.
I like a lot of his aphorisms. I can't remember them now, but I remember when I have reacted. I just remember my reactions to them. And I always thought, wow, he was pretty hardcore. He was the one that was a slave first, right?
I don't know, but I think that you can,
that's him.
As you interrupt my my exposition on the logos, then you can embody the failed logos.
I just introduced great information, so that's not a failure of the logos.
Heraclitus,
thank you very much.
Hanging out in the 300ish, 400ish BCs. All right, the BCs. That's historical terminology. So he is one of the first, if not the first, to use this Greek word logos. All right, and it means I say, like it's Greek, ancient Greek kind of for in one sense just I say, but all the way back there we're going to start to see the idea of the logos as being something rational and something kind of opposed to chaos. And associated with the ability to speak and to make sense of the world and this kind of logical thinking. Now let's move from ancient Greece up to briefly
Where are we going?
We're going to Greek-inspired Judaism, the thought there, which is going to lead into Christian notions of the logos. So this concept of the logos gets talked about by some philosophers that are Jewish, but that are very much influenced by Greek thought, which we've talked about before. How important to Western thought that time period is. We talked about it in our podcast on Hereditary, I think. All right. So then, this is going to take forever, and if I try to go through all this, we still see this word logos used, and it still has to do with there's a divine element to it. There starts to be a divine element to it, but specifically when we get into Christianity now. So now we're into Christianity, and we're seeing the word logos, and in a very famous Bible verse, which I don't know if I can quote for you, but it's something like, it's in the Gospel of John. Cue the Christian rock music. The word, I can't fucking misquote the Bible. Look it up. It's worth I shouldn't say fuck. I can't misquote the Bible. I'm not really getting a good audience here. All the Christians are like, what is wrong with this guy? And, so.
Our devout audience.
So, let's just say the word was God, God was the word, or something like that. It's very important, actually. Look it up, please, for me. It's John. Okay. It's the Gospel of John. And it is very important. Logos, and then you can read it. So the Christians now have this word, logos. And this is think of it now as, so think about the totality of the transcendent God in the sky, which is so cut off from humanity because it's so far up in the sky. It's so far away from humanity. There needs to be an intermediary. And the Christians start to see the intermediary as logos, but also as synonymous with Jesus Christ. Because remember, he is kind of, not just symbolically, but in the story, the Son of God. So there's this transcendent God. Then there's the logos, which now if you have the Bible verse, you want to read it?
Yeah.
Please.
I think is it John 1:1?
It is indeed.
That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon, and our hands have handled of the word, in parentheses, logos, of life.
It's not the right one.
It's
not the right one. It is John, because John is what's called the Gnostic gospel in some ways. It's more influenced by Gnosticism. It's so famous. All the Christians, any of the Christians listening,
what is it? Give me
the word was God, and the word was with God, and it was good, or something.
Okay, here. So how about let's try another one. This is the secret Bible.
But John 1:1 is the correct one.
Well, that's what it said.
God, you can't even read the Bible.
In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made.
Okay, that's
Without
enough.
him nothing was made that has been made. I love it.
So I don't know what that other thing you were reading. I
love the Bible.
You got this one right. In the beginning was the Logos, and the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. So now we've ancient Greeks, Heraclitus rocking around, doing aphorisms. Nietzsche loved him. Then we move into Hellenic influenced Judaism and the thoughts there, which is directly linked to Christianity, obviously. And so now we get this. We're the Logos with Christianity. All this is going to have to do with The Shining, I swear to you. After that, we get the Logos in Neoplatonic thought. Okay, that's now. So let's tie something else into this, which we talked about on this podcast. You have the ideal form of Plato, right? Mm-hmm. You're familiar with that. We've talked about it. All right.
We've spoken about that on one of the Truman Show podcasts. I think it was the first one, because we're talking about whatever the forms.
Yeah, exactly.
Just watch it.
The allegory of the cave, I think is what we were talking about.
Yeah.
So again, the form, remember, is this perfect representation that is transcendent and impossible for humans to actually deal with.
Obtain.
So when I'm talking about Neoplatonic thought, what I'm talking about is the people that took Plato's writings, and then it starts to fuse in and have a fusing with Christian thought also. All right. But then some of this ends up being heretical and related to Gnosticism. Here's how it is. From the ideal form, you have the Logos. The Logos is kind of the communication from that ideal form to humanity. But that is a word called the demiurge that you find in Gnosticism. The demiurge is not God, but it seems like God. And sometimes in Gnosticism, the demiurge tricks people. All right? Let's lay that aside for an episode.
The demiurge is also what we spoke about in the Truman episode.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was the same one. I think it might have been, but it was this idea of what you think you know. It's the Descartes idea. He also has that, like, the, what is it, the evil demon deception, where what if everything is created as an illusion, and the point of the creation is not the good of creation that God does, but to deceive, and that would be the demiurge's motive.
So now, skipping over some other historical periods, if anyone's still with us at this point, we're just going to go straight to Carl Jung, 19th century.
As we should.
So Logos is important in his thought also, as a masculine, rational principle of order, as opposed to, not opposed like in a fight, but as a
the other side
paired opposite of eros, which is another Greek word, which is associated with the feminine. Okay? So now, this is why The Shining and the character of Jack Torrance is, to me, the symbol of the failure of logos in the individual of that person. It's not that it's bad in and of itself. It's that he fails to embody correctly this concept which we have had in Western thought for 2,500 years. And the most simple way of looking at it is that he is a writer. You have to think about, fans of the Word of the Podcast will know, how that word logos and that prefix is associated with words often. Okay, so he's a writer, but he is clearly a failure, and this is shown in the movie by the fact that he doesn't actually write anything. He just writes one sentence over and over upon page upon page upon page. He's the failure of the masculine principle as well in this film, and we see that because he's a terrible father. He's abused his child before the film's even started. He is confused by drunkenness, in essence. He's a confused person. He's not a responsible person in a lot of different ways. He's been probably fired from being a teacher, maybe because maybe word got out that he abused his kid. That would be a good reason to fire a teacher, you know. So then this thing happens, which I think is interesting. Finally, and I think we've mentioned this also, he, at the end of the film, his inarticulate screaming is the perfect example of someone who can't articulate, who can't get communication across, who fails the logos. That's what he does. He's just howling. And in the second to last or third to last scene, you actually see in his frozen image, he's frozen. It looks exactly like Dante's portrayal of Satan in the depths of hell, frozen. That's what it reminded me of, is that image of that. So that's what I came up with when I watched this movie. I was thinking about that because I've been reading Carl Jung. I was thinking about that, and people might be a little more aware of this idea in Jordan Peterson sometimes touches upon this and has to try to explain, no, I'm not trying to divide everything up as male and feminine. I'm just trying to say that throughout time and mythology, this has been a division that has been understood symbolically, you know, in philosophy and religion, all those kinds of things. So that's what I see. Jack Torrance failed logos. Yeah.
Well, that's a very interesting, I thought that was a really cool way to look at it, because he is, I mean, what is a writer but a figure that is supposed to be able to order words, to take ideas and put them into coherent words. And so his inability to do that is the failure of being able to use the word. And that failure extends beyond just the logos, though, because he's also a failure as you can kind of, the way I saw him was from the more of the psychological realm, and as opposed to like this more philosophical idea. So he fails on many levels. But it's a really cool thing when you realize a movie like this where the monster is part of the family, where the monster is actually the father of the family. And so that there's a huge subversion of what the father role is supposed to be. So father is supposed to be provider and protector, you know, and he does the opposite of that here. He doesn't take care of his family. He doesn't really provide for them. He's fired from his last job, and he does the opposite of protect them. He endangers them. So there's this total subversion of the idea of the father figure here. And so that subversion turns him into a monster. But something that I notice about his character is this kind of emotional profile of a figure that is so beset by resentment and guilt that it turns him into the monster. So we're going to get into a little bit more shortly that idea of whether your failures make you susceptible to becoming a monster, because there is a distinction here where he is the one that is vulnerable to these demonic forces in the Overlook. His wife seems to be having a good old time. She's chilling. enjoying the maze, enjoying walking around the place, watching TV with the kid, just hanging out. The kid is mostly having a good time. He's a little, wonky, but that's another issue. He doesn't. He is at risk of the malicious forces in the hotel, but not at risk of becoming used by them. He is endangered by them. And so there's something important about, again, that idea of location here, because the hotel is a character in the movie for sure. And there's a difference in how people perceive the hotel. So there's the hotel normally when it's full of people where it's just functioning fine. But then when it can close people within it, when it gets to the situation where they're locked in the hotel, and when it has the right victim in it, suddenly it becomes a malevolent force. And so the hotel is able to use Jack's weakness, right? So his resentment and failure grow in the hotel. And as his resentment grows and as he becomes the monster in that hotel, the child becomes more endangered and more vulnerable to the damage that that hotel can do. So, there's this idea of a larger malevolent force. It's not that Jack is per se the monster originally, but that he can become the monster in a certain situation. And then we also spoke about this, before we did the podcast. There's this difference where the kid is apprehensive of the hotel. Wendy is kind of lukewarm about the hotel. Seems like she wants to like it at first, the idea. But Jack loves the hotel in this very weird, I love it here. What are you talking about? When the kid, I forget if it's a kid or Wendy that asks him, one of them is like, do you think it's a good idea? Should we go? Do you like it? And he's like, of course I like it. In this very weird kind of forced and strange way that makes you think, in the same way an alcoholic is more susceptible to being around alcohol and having that go wrong, right? Like when you have a certain vulnerability, something that can otherwise be inane becomes a danger.
It all ties in to, again, this idea of the logos and, because that is associated with the masculine principle. And, maybe I've just been reading too much Carl Jung lately, but you keyed in right on the fact that it's this resentment that comes out of him, which you obviously see in the film. That Jung says that in a male, the anima is the female part of the male, and that when these things are off, that resentment is one of the main things you see in a man when they're not aligned properly with the world. So, and then you get potentially an actual symbol of that in the film with the woman in the bathtub in room 237. So that's a possibility there for speculation.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
That scene is so gnarly.
It is.
They did a good job making that a disturbing scene.
So I hold to the idea that he was a monster to begin with before he even got there, which you see. Look, you see him, the way he talks to his family in the car ride up there. He's impatient. And look, we all get impatient sometimes. We all have resentment sometimes.
No, he's a total asshole. Yeah, and he's already hurt the kid. So,
Right. So, everyone has their failings, but he, from the beginning, is a failure. And then you put a failure in that. Here's what I thought was interesting. He becomes a kind of satanic employee. So he's become a monster. He's become a failure. Now, who's his new boss? And I think he even kind of talks in this sense of the hotel becomes his boss, his employer, through this figure of Grady, who was a person who was in the past 10 years before, I guess, the father that had killed his family in that same place.
Yeah, it seems to imply that that's him, though they originally name him as Charles Grady, and then the butler insists that his name is Delbert Grady. So, and then the butler insists that that's not him. Well, he has that family, but that he's not the one that did that. And so there's some gray there about whether Jack has always been the caretaker or what it is, if he's at what time he becomes possessed by maybe this Grady spirit, that comes in and makes him that person that's always been there. Maybe it's the same spirit that always enacts the event, but just different physical vessels that are sacrificed for it. You know what I mean?
I do, because it didn't make sense to me that he has like this. I think he has a kind of an English accent. He doesn't seem like someone that in 1970 would have been there with his family. That figure.
Working.
So, again, I didn't delve into all the theories and all that stuff.
Details.
I didn't want to do that. I wanted to kind of just take the movie as, just take my own look at the movie. Because I know that this is, as you mentioned, this is a film that has been analyzed many, many, many times. So
incredibly so. Yeah. There's you can find no shortage of videos and essays and whatever of people being like, did you notice this fuzzy picture frame on the wall and what's in the picture and that it reappears here? And it's I like those things too, but that's a different version of dealing with a movie,
So he becomes this. So he's a failure in the real world in dealing with reality. He's a failure as a father. He's a failure as a man in a lot of ways. He's a failure as a writer. He is the veiled logos. Now, what does a person like that do? Well, they have to be subordinate to something. They have to put themselves in some sort of hierarchy. So, or they off themselves, which would have been the proper thing for him to do, instead of murdering his family. I know that I often just suggest that people should. Okay, we'll leave that in case there's YouTube.
You can't say that people who murder their family should probably just kill themselves instead. I guess that's mean.
I think you can.
But
I think you can. I'll say it now.
It would have been less harm.
Correct.
Than trying to kill your innocent kid and wife. Maybe just you're the problem. Now, I don't advocate that solution, of course. I think maybe, don't be the problem. But in this particular instance, it would have been less of a crime.
So he turns. When you're a failure, you then turn. I feel like people that are failures they're susceptible to wanting malevolent forces to control them, so they at least have some sort of identity or success. So now he can become successful by playing out what the whatever evil spirits are possessing him, and it's done in a very job description way. Okay, it seems that your boy is causing problems. You will need to correct him. You will probably need to correct your wife. You'll need, and which is just saying probably murder them. And he gets into it, and he has to, because what else? That's what happens when people fail over and over again and fail themselves. They'll turn to real evil, and they'll turn to real evil for direction.
He has no purpose, right? It's very clear that he's kind of this aimless figure that does not take seriously his responsibility to his child or his wife or himself, his task that he sets before him of writing. So if you have no task, what is the saying that idle hands are the devil's workshop or something like that? It's this idea that, you're not going to be possessed by good if you're sitting around shirking all your responsibilities. That would be the task that you have taken up then. To be possessed by good would be to actually live up to your responsibilities, to take that on. Instead, if you don't take that upon yourself, you get something put upon you. And you see that. It's such an interesting visualization of this like devil's bargain, right? He's kind of aimlessly, and you see what happens is, what does he do? He starts to look for alcohol, which is the escape.
But what's really, when you were talking about this and I was talking about, I thought about this, you know, he goes to the bar and he doesn't have money the first time, but he says, but the bartender says, your credit is good here. It's like, okay, so here's the evil forces, but they're seducing him. You know, it's, oh, well, you know, they're treating him like a person of importance. And that you see that in real life all the time.
Yes.
That you can make people do bad things by treating people that have been failures as mildly important and puffing them up, and then all of a sudden they'll do all kinds of terrible things. And that's what that scene is. He goes there, the bartender, it's his favorite bartender, you know, and they engage in this kind of, like you said, very old-timey,
like chauvinistic type of like,
can't live
women,
with them, can't
what are
live
they
without
good for?
Yeah.
And it's this very banter of like, it's all this, it's and it's literally a facade. There's this stagnation to it. This idea that he would go into this ritzy bar full of these, you know, aristocrat type high class people, go up to this bar and be having this, you know, banter with the waiter or the bartender, and but it's fake, you know, it's unearned status. And so what do you get? And this is the same thing that plays out in life, where people look for shortcuts to status. They look for and that same thing, like ego flattery above genuine achievement. And that's always like, that's a biblical story. This idea that you can be, it's important that we're seduced into evil. Like these figures of whatever mythology you look in, this idea of a demon appearing as something seductive, whether it's wealth, whether it's status, whether it's a partner or something like that, some kind of pleasure. It's always this idea that you can have something you haven't earned. Just come forward. And he even go on.
He has credit because he's already employed by the evil forces in essence. But look, you know, you also get into all these other theories about, you know, it shows him at the end in the picture, and it says July 4th at the very end of the movie. It shows him in the ballroom dressed in a tuxedo. So, you know, maybe he was some sort of, you know, to kind of maybe wrap this concept up. There is something, and this is kind of slightly related. There is something about an old hotel that you know, it's like, you know, there is some sort of chaos and probably bad things have gone on if a building is old enough, you know, and this movie plays with that a lot. It plays with that very simple thing that I think a lot of people feel when they go into a hotel. There is this kind of transitory thing about it, but then there's also, in this film, it's linked to a history of violence and a history of a lot of things that we could do other episodes on, but we decided not to really deal with those in this podcast because it's
too much. Anyway.
Yeah, it's too much. There'd be too many episodes. I think.
Yeah, because there's the Indian burial ground idea that's on the thing, and that's a very prominent idea in the movie. But that takes everything in a whole different direction, because there's also the idea of generational curses, which I believe the book goes into more detail on Jack's father as having that same abusive background, same kind of abusive behavior towards his mother, but Jack still kind of idealized his father. So there's this idea of playing out the same curse, which the hotel itself does. It replays this history of violence.
Yeah, there's a lot to say about it, but I think that, you know, we've keyed in on one of the main ideas, this failure of the failure of the masculine, failure of the logos, however you want to put it.
Yeah. Well, it's very interesting because so I like that idea of that you become a handmaid of evil if you fail yourself, because there's this one part, I think it's where he's locked in the storeroom, and Grady, presumably Grady, we can't see him, but it's his voice. He says, you're failing. You're failing even to do this evil act that has been asked of you. And you see Jack kind of almost go into this like serious, almost trance-like mood as Grady asks him, do you give your word that you will complete this task? And he says, I give you my word, which really ties into that idea of the logos, right? I give you my word. It's both a responsibility, a promise, but now it's that idea of like, I'm giving you, there's this other idea, right? I'm giving it away. I'm giving the logos to you. I'm giving that rationality, that ability to create order, to enact meaningful, sensical action. I'm giving it to you, figure of evil and chaos. And that's what happens. He loses that. He becomes the failed logos, the absence of that in a way, that absence of ability to make order and meaningful action.
In conclusion, on my part anyway, I just want to say that the Space Moon Hotel will not be initially haunted for any...
initially.
I mean, look, again, like I said, you have a hotel long enough.
Do you think space is haunted?
Not yet.